All right, so I am Tara Schmidlin. I'm a genetic counselor at the Coriell Institute. I may have talked or emailed with some of you. I'm just going to talk a little bit about the CPMC result for coronary artery disease. At this point in time, we've released one genetic variant for coronary artery disease. In the future, we hope to release some more for each disease, but as of now, we just have the one result for one genetic variant. So first, we'll talk a little bit about the different genetic and environmental contributions to coronary artery disease. We'll talk about the specific variant that we reported. We'll talk a little bit about other genetic variants and how they influence coronary artery disease risk. We'll go over the limitations of the CPMC testing, the implications for your family members, and just a review of where you can find some more information on our website. This I can skip, I think, but just to remind you on our reports, we do have a How Common tab that gives you some context of how common coronary artery disease is, and that's the very first tab on your report under coronary artery disease. The next tab is the causes. So this is where we talk about the genetic versus non-genetic risk factors. And we know that about 49% of coronary artery disease is thought to be due to genetic factors, and about 51% is thought to be due to environmental factors, things like smoking, diet, exercise. Now, just to remind you, we've given you a report for one genetic variant that happens to be a gene that's in between these two, a variant that's in between these two genes, the CDKN2A and CDKN2B. However, in that bucket, contributing to the 49% genetic variant risk are other genetic variants. And these are just a few. These are just a few that are known and well described, but there's many, many more. So I just kind of wanted to give you a sense of, in this bucket, there's more than just the one that we're giving you, and the one that we're giving you is the one in red. So just kind of keep that in the back of your mind. We're giving you one genetic variant at a time. We know there are several, probably up to 100 or more, playing a role in coronary artery disease. In addition to that, there's also genetic variants that play a much larger role. So one of the things that the CPMC study focuses on for all the diseases, we look at genetic variants that have a relatively small impact on developing that disease, but that are common in the population. And that's different from a disease called familial hypercholesterolemia, because that disease is less common in the population, and the genetic variants have a much bigger role in that disease. So in this instance, just for contrast, this is a disease where we have mutations in the low-density lipoprotein receptor and apolipoprotein B genes, and those genes basically cause your body to be not able to remove that LDL or bad cholesterol if you have mutations in those genes. It also raises your cholesterol level and gives you an increased risk for atherosclerosis and early heart attack. In men, we're talking heart attacks in the 40s and 50s, women in the 50s and 60s. About 5% of coronary artery disease that has an onset before age 55 is due to this familial hypercholesterolemia condition. About 85% of men with familial hypercholesterolemia will have a heart attack before the age of 60. So that's very different than the genetic variants that we talk about in the CPMC study, where your risk will be higher compared to somebody without that variant to have coronary artery disease, but it would not at all be anywhere close to having an 85% risk of having coronary artery disease. Okay, so the genetic variant risk tab of your report is the tab where you will actually see your result. This is where we tell you how many copies of the risk variant and non-risk variant that you have. Just to remind you, you have 2 copies of every gene, one from your mother and one from your father. And each copy may have changes called genetic variants. So those genetic variants we spell out for you on this part of the slide in the details section of the report. So the risk variant is actually represented by the C, the non-risk variant is represented by the G. And for this particular result, we have one of each. Another thing to point out on the genetic variant tab of your report is this variant number 1. So this is just our internal numbering system. Again, we hope to give you more genetic variants in the future, but for now we just have one. The number beside it, the RS, stands for reference SNP. That's kind of the scientific number. So if you were going to Google to find more information about this variant, that would be the number that you would want to look up. Variant 1 is just an internal CPMC number. On the details part of the genetic variant tab, you'll also find the name of the gene or the location, or kind of the address of where this genetic variant is. So again, it's a variant between the CDKN2A and 2B genes, and that's on chromosome 9p to 1.3. So that's where you would find it if you want that level of detail. We also give you the key for which letter is the risk variant and which letter is the non-risk variant. So again, your result's always up here in the yellow bar. This particular individual has one of each. In the population data box, this is just how common these results are in the general population. Typically, it's in the Caucasian population just because that's where most of the research is done. We do try to match this to reported ethnicity of the participant as often as we can. In the majority of cases, though, the data is from Caucasian populations. So we always state where we give you the information and where that's coming from, and that's always at the bottom. And then we remind you, as many times as we can, that this genetic variant is coming up with only a small fraction of the total risk for coronary artery disease. Again, if you think back to that slide before with the bucket, the 49% bucket, there's many genetic variants in that bucket, and we're only giving you one. The next screen that you will see is a risk summary screen, and this just shows you all of the relative risks for the variables that we provide to you in your results. So for coronary artery disease, we give you your risk based on your family history, we give you your risk based on diabetes, your smoking status, and this single genetic variant. Now, we all know these aren't all the risk factors for coronary artery disease because Dr. Weinstock just went over several others. We only give you what we can capture in those surveys. So in the surveys that you filled out in the very beginning of joining this study, we asked you things about your lifestyle, if you smoke, if you drink alcohol, how much you exercise, things like that. We're only able to report back to you as much as we could capture in those surveys. We don't ask you for your blood pressure number or your cholesterol levels. Not many of you would probably know them off the top of your heads, so we don't actually collect that information and therefore can't report you back those risks. The other thing to keep in mind about this particular slide is that these are just kind of a summary of your risk factors, and it says up here, risk factors may be related to each other and that the estimates cannot be combined. And that's really because we don't know how these things are interacting and influencing each other. So we don't really know how to combine your risk accurately. Say if you're a diabetic and you smoke and you have a genetic variant risk, we can't turn that into you have a 30% lifetime risk of heart disease or a 50% lifetime risk of heart disease reliably, because we're not quite sure how those variables all interact. There are, some statistical models out there that are trying to make assumptions to do that and say, if you have multiple genetic variants, you might add them together or multiply them together to get a risk, but they're making a lot of assumptions on how those variants are interacting with each other that we don't really know. We don't know if you have multiple genetic variants, if they are additive or if one cancels the other one out. That's stuff that we're not completely aware of at this point in time. That's all stuff that's being studied. So this is a close-up of the genetic variant risk tab. So we gave you the information in the format of relative risk. This particular individual's result is having one copy of the risk variant and one copy of the non-risk variant. And based on that, they have a relative risk of 1.3, which means that they're 30% more likely to develop coronary artery disease than somebody who has no copies of the risk variant. We also give you your risk based on your family history. In this case, family history for us was defined by whether or not you had one or both parents who had coronary artery disease. And this particular individual had at least one parent with coronary artery disease. And this report, I think the sample report is from a female. So the relative risk was 1.2 or 20% more likely to develop coronary artery disease. If this were a male, the risk is a little bit higher. For a male with a parent with coronary artery disease, the risk is about 1.4 or 40% more likely to develop coronary artery disease. For other risk factors, we talk about 2 additional risk factors on your coronary artery disease report. One of those is whether or not you have diabetes. Again, this is a sample report from a female. A female with diabetes has a relative risk of 2.4 or 2.4 times more likely to develop coronary artery disease than someone who's not diabetic. For males, it's a little bit lower at 1.7, but still a higher risk than somebody who is not diabetic. And for smoking status, being a smoker makes you 2.7 times, or roughly 3 times more likely to develop coronary artery disease than someone who's not a smoker. This is for females. For males, the risk is around 2 times greater if you're a smoker. We often get asked about what the results mean for family members potentially. So I'll go through an example. We can't actually comment on the risks to your children without having tested them, but this is something, if we know both parents' results, we can kind of infer what they might have inherited based on knowing what the parents have. So to go through this example, both of the parents in this situation have at least 1 copy of the risk variant, and so that they can pass on. In this situation, they each passed on 1 copy of the non-risk variant, which resulted in an offspring with 2 copies of the non-risk variant. So there's a 25% chance with every pregnancy that they would have a child that would have 2 copies of the non-risk variant. Another thing that could happen in another pregnancy, the mother could have passed on her non-risk variant, and the father could have passed on his risk variant, resulting in a child that has 1 copy of the risk variant and 1 copy of the non-risk variant. Or vice versa, we could have had dad passing on his non-risk and mom passing on her risk. So there's a 50% chance with every pregnancy of having a child that has 1 of each. And finally, if both parents pass on the risk variant, and the child will have 2 copies of the risk variant, and they would have a 25% risk with every pregnancy to pass that on to an offspring. So just to give you kind of a summary, this is not all of the limitations, but this is kind of the highlights. If you look at the limitations tab, there's more there, but really just to highlight it, your CPMC result alone is not diagnostic of coronary artery disease. So the variant that we looked at is not the same as that familial hypercholesterolemia example that I gave earlier. That would be an example of a disease where the genetic variant is significant in playing a very large role in the development of the disease. That's not what we're looking at in the CPMC. So your result can't diagnose you, and it also doesn't rule out a future diagnosis. So if you were one of the lucky individuals who didn't inherit any risk variants, it doesn't mean you're not at any risk for coronary artery disease. You could have 4 or 5 other genetic variants for which you would have the risk variant that we just don't know because we didn't look at those. And again, other risk factors, such as your cholesterol and your blood pressure, like Dr. Weinstock just went over, may have a much more significant impact on your risk for coronary artery disease than the genetic variant that we presented to you. I'm sure many of you are at least familiar with this tab in order to actually register for an event. This is always on the What Do I Do Now tab, any upcoming educational sessions. You can click on that link and it'll actually take you to a screen to register for any of the seminars. You can also register for seminars just by logging into my account, and then on the left-hand side there's a Register for Seminars link as well. The other things that are available to you on this tab of every report is that you can click on this button and it will open an email window. You can send a question to myself or Aaron. You can go to this link and read more about the condition or watch a video, whichever you prefer, that talks a little bit more about coronary artery disease. Or you can actually click on this link and schedule an appointment to talk with either myself or Aaron in much more depth about your results, and we're happy to do that either in person or over the phone, whichever is more convenient for you. This is just to show you when you first go to our website, if you look all the way over to the right, the health conditions, if you click on that, you'll get this list of conditions. These are all links to that educational material that I had mentioned to you. So these are the links that would take you to the web pages that talk about the conditions and have the videos that give you a little bit more background information about the diseases. And this is just if you happen to click on that request a genetic counseling appointment, you will have the opportunity to pick a time and pick a method to be contacted and tell us a little bit about what you want to talk about. And then somebody will be in touch with you to set up a time to talk with us. And that's free, and it's available to you, throughout your participation in the study, so please take advantage of it. And one last thing, I don't know how many of you have noticed this on your account screen. Under my questionnaires, we do have several questionnaires in there that are available for you to complete so that you can tell us a little bit about what you're doing with this information. What are you doing with your coronary artery disease results, your type 2 diabetes results, your iron overload results? Who have you shared them with? What changes have you made, if any? We really need this information to know how helpful this type of information is. So if you have the time, they're optional. We also are giving out, putting your name into a drawing. The first 500 people to complete each one will be put into a drawing for a $25 gift card from Amazon.com. So there's a little bit of incentive there as well. And that's,
just to add to that, we're
yeah.
interested even if you think it's not useful. So we don't just want favorable responses, but personalized medicine and genetic information like this is really just in its infancy. There are a number of companies that sell this type of information, and the whole purpose of this research study is to figure out, is it even useful? Should it be sold to people, or are those companies that are selling it selling snake oil? This is really important information for the research community, for the medical community. If it's really valuable, then we want to figure out how to translate it to the clinic even faster. If it's not useful, then we want to work with organizations like the FDA that oversees some types of genetic testing, so that it's not put on the market and taking money out of people's pockets if there's no value. So answering these questions is really important. It is an optional part of the study, but I would encourage all of you, regardless of whether or not your perception is that it's useful or not useful, to take a few minutes to fill them out. I would say each one takes about 5 minutes. They're pretty short, and you will continue to get one for each disease that you receive results for.
Sure.
I'm interested in the slide that you showed, the scales, and then the one of the scales had a lot of little red balls, different colored balls in it. I'd like to see if you can quantify this particular risk factor that you have identified, this the red one, the CKN 2A and 2B. What percentage of that 49% is this one little red ball, do you think?
Well, we don't know, and the reason why we don't know is that not all the balls have been accounted for yet. We don't know all of the genes that are playing a role. We're still discovering them. So the way they come up with this 49% number, they do kind of twin studies or adoption studies and look at if both twins develop coronary artery disease, then we're more likely to think that it's due to genetic factors that percentage of the time, or if they look at environmental factors. And this roughly ends up being about 50-50 between twin pairs.
Well, I mean, in the vein of how useful is this information,
right?
If this is only of the 49%, I mean, there's a statement that says the genetic factors is only a portion of. The question is this little red ball such a small part that is insignificant for us to think about or worry about? I mean, or could you kind of, okay, you can't give an exact number, but can you say it's 1%, 5%, and the 10% range? Can you give me some quantification of what it means? Because otherwise, it's useless information. If you can't tell us at all what it is.
The part of the information that's useful, and to go back to this was just looking at that genetic variant alone. This is the risk for coronary artery disease, just looking at that genetic variant. So if you had one copy of that genetic variant, you are 30% more likely to develop coronary artery disease than somebody who has no copies. If you have 2 copies of this genetic variant, and that's not shown here, then this little green disc moves up to about 1.7, and you're 70% more likely. That's just looking at that genetic variant. But we don't want you to necessarily completely focus on that, because that's one genetic variant out of potentially several that are playing a role. So that's what we're able to tell you by just looking at that. But even its utility is kind of limited, because we know, one, there's several other genes, and we also know there's several environmental factors that are playing a role too: the smoking, the obesity, the physical activity.
You quantify that as a 49-51.
Right.
But within the 49 bucket, I just seem to lose what the significance of this one particular one that you've identified, without knowing how many others there are, or what part does this one particular one play.
Right. That's all stuff that we're
to use the information at least make meaningful.
Right.
So it's a really good and astute question. The downside is that when you don't know all of the many factors, so in Tara's bucket, I think she put in 5 or 6 balls. We know there are at least 20, probably more, like 50 to 100. And to tease apart the percent contribution of each one is very difficult, because they have overlapping functions. So some of them contribute to the same pathway. So without knowing all of the genes that fill up that bucket and what each of their individual roles are, it's very hard to tease apart. This one contributes 1%, this one contributes 5%. If you look across all complex diseases, so diseases that are caused by a combination of the environment and genetics, There are very few published studies that show percent contribution. In fact, off the top of my head, I can think of one, and that relates to obesity. It's just a difficult scientific conclusion to come to, and so the information isn't out there. We would love to be able to provide you with that information, and if that comes out, we will certainly update our materials to reflect that. But unfortunately, we can't give you anything more than what the scientific community knows today.
Is there any reason you're holding back the other 20 that you know about, that, you know, the genes that affect the coronary artery disease?
We've made the decision to present them one at a time because of that not knowing how to combine them. So we don't really know if we should take all 20 of them and multiply them together and come up with a risk score. If we should take all 20 of them and add them together and come up with a risk score. It may be the case because they have
separately.
That's the goal. Going forward, that's the goal,
So
to report them individually, so that hopefully in the future you would see a report that would give you multiple green discs on it. So that you would see like another column here with another green disc for a different genetic variant, perhaps. This is something that we would like to do going forward, to give you more genetic variants.
I would like to encourage you to speed it up, because if there's 20 and you can only do one every 6 months, it's going to take 10 years. It's too slow for me.
Sure.
Yeah, me too.
And we are, we're trying to do as many different diseases as we can so that we have broad representation over several diseases. We're also looking at some of the genetics for drug response. So we have a lot of things on our plate coming forward, but we are also trying to look at being able to present multiple genetic variants at a time.
Do you have to go back to our sample each time to look at the next risk factor, or
No.
you really have all that information? It's just how quickly you can parse it out to us?
We run the test once, and that has the sites that the chip is able to capture. One limitation is that the technology that we use is able to look at certain sites, but not all sites. So some of the things we may want to look at may not be on that technology. So that's somewhat of the limitation. The other thing is what takes the amount of time that it does, and why these reports come out as infrequently or maybe as frequently as they do, is that we have to do all the research and build these reports. So we have to find all of the data to support the relative risk numbers that we're giving you. We have to go through the scientific literature and make sure that what we're reporting is valid. We're looking for these genetic variants. We want them to be found in multiple studies. We want them to be found in multiple different populations before we're convinced that there's a real association there. So there may be a lot of literature out there saying, hey, we have a panel of 20 genetic variants that we think are playing a role in coronary artery disease. If researcher A finds that, that's great. If researcher B does, another study with another population and he only finds 4 or 5 of them, then we haven't verified that those others are playing a role. So that's some of the lag too, is that we're trying to figure out which ones are truly associated and how they're associated. It takes a lot of time. It just.
To give you an example of that, there was a study out a few years ago that showed about 6% of all genetic association studies are actually replicated. So that means if 100 studies are done, each of them finding a different association between a genetic variant and a disease, only 6 of them will be replicated in another study. So we don't want to give you information and find out the next day that it's wrong. It's been disproven. So we're really trying to go through the literature and make sure that we're giving you information that's valid. So that's part of what slows things down. There's a lot of literature out there. A lot of things were found in one small group of 50 people. We're not going to give you that. A lot of things were found once and then disproven. So we're really trying to make sure that what we give you is accurate more than anything else.
If I could just make a comment on that, because I think this lecture is confusing. We're talking about genomics here. The stuff I talk to is all based in hundreds of thousands of patients. That is validated. This is not.
That's
so
a very good
don't
point.
confuse those two things. What I told you is, it's well-established fact, but we don't know how this relates to it. So I just gave you some tools to think about if you think you're at increased risk, what you